US President Donald Trump says he must have Greenland. European leaders have hit back, accusing US of behaving like a bully. But Trump is not backing away. Before heading to Davos for the World Economic Forum, Trump was asked how far he is willing to go for Greenland. Trump replied, "You will find out." But he also struck a hopeful tone when asked if he was willing to risk the breakup of NATO to take control of Greenland. To which Trump said that US and NATO would eventually reach an agreement on the future of Greenland, but he quickly reiterated the need to acquire Greenland.
It's very interesting question. So I think something's going to happen that's going to be very good for everybody. Nobody's done more for NATO than I have, as I said before, in every way. I think that we will work something out where NATO is going to be very happy and where we're going to be very happy. But we need it for security purposes. We need it for national security and even world security. It's very important.
European leaders presented a united front before an expected showdown in Davos. French President Emmanuel Macron called out Donald Trump's bullying. He told the World Economic Forum that he preferred respect and rule of law instead of bullying and brutality.
And here in the epicenter of this continent, we do believe that we need more growth, we need more stability in this world. But we do prefer respect to bullies. We do prefer science to plotism, and we do prefer rule of law to brutality. You're welcome in Europe, and you are more than welcome to France.
Now, France has also called for NATO to hold an exercise in Greenland and said it was ready to contribute. Troops from several European countries are already participating in training exercises in Greenland. Now, Greenland's Prime Minister warned citizens that use of military force could not be ruled out. He asked them to be prepared for everything.
It is not likely that there will be a use of military force, but it has not been ruled out yet. This leader from the other side has made it very clear that it is not ruled out. And therefore, we must of course be prepared for everything. But we must emphasize that Greenland is part of the Western Alliance, NATO. And if there is further escalation, it will also have consequences for the entire outside world.
Former NATO chief and former Danish Prime Minister Anders Rasmussen has also urged Europe to hit back hard if Trump goes ahead with tariffs on allies. Listen to this.
And I think time has now come for Europe to stand up against this Trumpism. The time for flattering is over. It doesn't work. The fact is, Trump only respects force and strength and unity. And that's exactly what Europe should demonstrate right now.
Meanwhile, Lithuanian President Nausėda has proposed that sharing responsibility for the security of the Arctic and the North Atlantic world could provide a way out of the standoff. But as President Trump was in the air headed to Davos, his Treasury Secretary had an advice for Europe. Take a deep breath, he said. Scott Bessent said that Europeans should avoid reflexive anger and bitterness. Bessent asked them to sit down with the US president to listen to his arguments. And to discuss this further, we're now being joined live on the broadcast by James Jackson. He's a journalist and political analyst. We also have with us Greg Swenson, Chairman, Republicans Overseas, UK and International Affairs expert. Thank you so much both for joining us on the broadcast.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Mr.
Thanks
Jackson,
for having me.
Of course. Mr. Jackson, let me start with you first. Is President Trump putting America first by asserting US strategic interests, and especially regarding defense and Arctic security, or would you say that his style is rather too aggressive?
I don't think he's helping America in this situation. Trump's entire behavior since the start of this year, possibly before, has been to actually take America down from the global hegemon down to a regional hegemon or a regional dominant power. Actually, the entire world uses American currency. We live in an American-led order, in a sense, which has been crumbling for a little while. And for Trump, for some reason, that's not good enough. And he wants to trade that all for some rocky land in Greenland, which he probably doesn't even know the real size of. So he says it's America first. He's certainly turning his back on his allies, but really, I think what he's doing is demoting the US to a regional superpower and making the rest of the world enter a new era where it's no longer led by the US. The Pax Americana is gone.
Now, Mr. Spencer, would you agree to that? Because we know that European leaders have openly criticized Trump's tactics as coercive and damaging to NATO unity. And having said that, would you say that Trump's foreign policy is more bullying than visionary, perhaps?
Well, definitely not. I wouldn't agree on the bullying concept. The president is very candid, and I think many of the sort of European diplomatic elite are not used to that. That's not, their particular style. And President Trump's style is very different. He's very candid. He's very honest, and that's very, in many ways, that's very liberating, and it's very, it's refreshing. But on the other hand, the European Davos types don't really like that. And so I think in the long run, this is good for America, but more importantly, it's good for Europe and it's good for NATO to have a more dominant role in Greenland. There's a lot of, aspects to this conversation that we didn't really think about 10 years ago until the president brought it up in his first term. But now we realize that, there are critical issues around Greenland, the Arctic, shipping routes. You've got critical minerals that are important to the defense, not just of America, but of Europe and NATO. So, I think in the long run, while this is disruptive and it's uncomfortable for the European elite, I think, much of their complaining is performative at best. And I think in the long run, this will work out. I think I would take the advice of the Treasury Secretary, who I thought had some intelligent comments on this. And I think there'll be some interesting outcomes coming out of Davos this week.
That's interesting, Mr. Spencer, because I think critics and everybody agrees that he is not a traditional leader. And as you said, that his style of conversing is rather candid, but at the same time, the European leaders see Trump's push as undermining the sovereignty and alliance trust as well. Now, there's also this understanding that it may be a reckless overreach than strategic leadership, or would you still agree that it is perhaps another just way of a negotiating tactic, perhaps of overstating to ultimately get what he wants? Is that what we're witnessing right now, Mr. Spencer?
Yeah, absolutely. This is classic President Trump. He comes out of the gates with something that's really provocative or disruptive, and then things settle down a little bit. So, we've seen this movie before, and I think that the outcome is what's most important to President Trump, and it's most important to Americans and the West and the Europeans. So, they can complain all they want. I think, again, it's performative. It's a bit of, theater in this case, but the outcome is what's important, and the outcome is making sure that the defense of Greenland is taken care of, but also the defense of America and the defense of Europe. And so that's why, this is an important issue, and I think the president will get where he wants to go, and the outcome is the most important issue here. And I think the outcome will be a very good one in some sort of arrangement, whether it's a compact of free association, a COFA, which the U.S. has with countries like the Marshall Islands, small countries, and we'll see some sort of outcome like that. It's probably not going to be, annexation or any sort of, a purchase of Greenland for $750 billion, which the U.S. does not have. So, I think there's definitely some outcomes here that don't look and smell like what we are hearing out of the gates, but ultimately will be a good outcome for all, not just the U.S.
And speaking of the outcome, Mr. Jackson, I'd like you to weigh on this. All said and done, do you think Trump will be able to achieve his objective on Greenland?
I think so. To a certain degree, I think so. But the question is the cost, because my colleague over in London says that this will strengthen NATO. I'm afraid he's wrong. This will completely destroy NATO. This will be the end of NATO. If any change in Greenland's sovereignty will be the end of NATO. Maybe not immediately, as the Danish Prime Minister has indicated, but it will show allies that they cannot trust the US to respect their sovereignty and that they cannot trust the US to defend them. Of course, Trump is also very friendly with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So really, the Europeans feel like they're about to be fighting a war on two fronts. Whether it will the States, I think, is unlikely. But Europe has felt never more alone than before. Since the collapse of colonial empires, we've effectively relied on the US to defend us, and we're realizing the US is no longer a reliable ally. But of course, this isn't just about, the US didn't do that out of charity for the Western Europe. It was about projecting American power and dominance, which they profit from. And, you know, you can have more than one side profiting. That's the whole idea of trade. Pax Americana was clearly beneficial for Europe, especially with Russia showing aggression, territorial aggression. But ultimately, I think we are entering a new world order where old alliances do not count, and Europe will look elsewhere outside of the US or Russia, traditional superpowers, to perhaps to middle powers, as Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said in his speech at Davos, which is getting a lot of applause from Europe, or possibly to China. So, which right now, despite its domestic issues, looks like the superpower which respects international law and sovereignty the most. So Trump may actually be driving Europeans, his closest allies, into the arms of China. And I find it surprising that Republicans would welcome this.
Right. We hear you, Mr. Jackson. Now, the geopolitical context has become incredibly complex, especially this year with President Trump's politics and pronouncements, which are at the center of Davos as well. Now, European leaders are warning that Trump's tactics risk a dangerous spiral and could strain or even fracture NATO. So is this diplomacy undermining alliance cohesion at a critical moment? What would you say to that, Mr. Swenson? What's your take on this?
Well, I think the president made a comment in the introduction to this program that, you know, that NATO is stronger, and you have to give credit to President Trump, or a lot of credit, for NATO being stronger. Now, you know, perhaps the Russia-Ukraine conflict might have inspired the Europeans to beef up their defense and security. But I think in many respects, President Trump's been, you know, on one hand critical of NATO and the NATO countries for not meeting their security obligations. That's changing now that they've made commitments to, you know, spending 5% of GDP on defense and security. I'm not sure they can meet that metric because of the welfare states that most of the Western European countries are maintaining and will likely continue to maintain. So it will be difficult for them to meet that target, but, you know, good for the Europeans for finally stepping up and looking after their own defense. And so, you know, NATO is stronger because of President Trump, and I think we'll come out of this stronger again, because you know, Greenland needs to be secured. It needs to. It's an important geostrategic country at this point, while still a territory of Denmark. You know, I find the reference to colonialism interesting. That, you know, that Denmark, you know, has this so-called territory that's a bit of a legacy of colonialism, European colonialism. I think it's going to be in a much better position.
We hear you, Mr. Swenson. Of course, we'll have to wait and see how the situation develops from here. But for now, thank you so much both for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.